Welcome, everyone. You
Welcome.
are in the right place. If you are joining us for a conversation on preparing for death at birth, we'll give everyone a couple of minutes just to join us. A couple of minutes, a couple of seconds. We all know that how minutes feel on Zoom, like a lifetime.
It's true.
Thanks for joining us, everyone. We'll spend a little bit of time just walking through the agenda and some other logistics, but right now I wanted to take care of some housekeeping while everyone was joining us. We are expecting doulas and birth workers, funeral planners, really just anyone curious to unpack the benefits of planning for the end of life at the beginning of life, which is not something you tend to think about.
Mm-hmm.
So as you may have noticed, this is a recording of a conversation that Christy and I have had just a couple of days before you were seeing this. And with everyone in the room now, I am going to go ahead and introduce Christy Bauman, or at least give her the torch. She can introduce herself, and then we'll get started. Christy, welcome. Thank you. First, tell us where you are joining us from today.
I'm joining you from Asheville, North Carolina. So I'm on the East Coast. So my primary home is Seattle, Washington. So I'm literally on the other side of the United States, but I'm excited to be here. Thank you for having me. I think this is such an important conversation that is not talked about. And so a lot, I know, of my life has been sharing this conversation. So I'm a mental health therapist, 12 years now, and I work primarily out of Seattle, but my husband and I have a counseling center that we've just now had our second station, if you will, on the East Coast. So we have an East Coast site and a Pacific Northwest site. And I work with women mostly around sexual trauma and understanding their bodies. And I think it's so important to talk about death and talk about starting to prepare it from birth, because that is a part of my story. I lost my son at 41 weeks at stillbirth, and I'll talk and share about what that was like for me 9 years ago, and how Brave's life and death has changed my way of looking at life. And so I think too, it would be great if you want to also share about you and how you come to this place, Lindsay.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Christy, for your background and your work. My work is in communications and communicating hard conversations and crises, and working with actually big companies doing that. But I really started to apply that to my life when I had my son at 39 and a half weeks, and found out right before then that he had also passed away. And just in my research and the work that I'm doing around a collective called Revival Birth, it's a network of clinicians and birth workers and therapists and artists and inventors and designers and, you know, just really pregnancy survivors. And through that work, I came across Christy and got to meet her through her book tour, and just really appreciated the perspective that she shared. So we're very glad to sort of be able to take our conversations to you all, and are excited to hear where you guys are from, and just use this as a launching point to have more of these conversations.
Yes.
And I know one of the first things that Christy and I really wanted to talk about and sort of bring to everyone's awareness is that we are talking about very sensitive topics. Certainly we'll be sharing from our perspective, but it's also worth noting that there's incredible injustices that happen at the end of some in utero life due to medical racism that we are just getting statistics on, but has been happening for decades and really hundreds of years. But we want to address that as something that it's really why we do a lot of the work that we do, because those injustices are not centered. A lot of, frankly, in my experience, a lot of white women aren't even aware of the injustices. They're not even aware that stillbirth is an option. They actually fall on sort of the other extreme where it's, 9 to 10 baby showers. And, so there is a lot of inequity that we'll certainly talk about, but that is not the focus of this conversation, but it is an incredible part of the conversation that must be heard and shared over and over again. Christy, is there anything you'd like to add?
Yeah, I'm so thankful for you to say that. I think it is so good for us to just name that we are two white women sharing our story, and yet we are aware that the lens needs to be so much bigger because of inequality and injustices. And so I would say we come from a more womanist viewpoint, which integrates all sexual identities and all race and color of skin into the conversation. And so we just want to put that out there. Also, by naming the bias of just who we are and what we come with, we still want to bring in the stories at large that are larger than us as we bring our individual story.
Absolutely. And I think, Christy, you'll agree, and we can both do this for each other during this conversation, but call to attention any privilege that we've had that is not guaranteed for everyone, I think will be valuable, but certainly we appreciate the space to continue to learn and grow as we're unpacking and also survivors ourselves.
Yes.
And so for a lot of this conversation, like I said, we won't focus on the injustices, but we will focus on sharing our experiences, highlighting different perspectives, providing some just essential considerations should this experience happen to you or someone that you know of, because everyone falls sort of along a spectrum of their education around this. Might not just have some of sort of the basic tools and resources. And so we'd love to be a place where you can get started and be an open, protected space to ask any questions that might feel uncomfortable. Or I think a lot of times culturally, we think that if we talk about these certain things and name them, that they will happen to us.
Right.
And it's quite the opposite. And so we're excited to sort of shine a light on the healing that can happen through conversations like this.
Yes, well said. Well said.
And so I think just moving through our conversation, Christy, I would love to hear just your experience with pregnancy with Brave at a high level. Was that your first pregnancy? I know certainly some of these, but I think, it is important to talk about it if it's your first pregnancy or sequential pregnancies, because where it falls and where stillbirth falls in giving birth can matter in what tools you use or the type of healing you pursue. But yeah, can you share a little bit about?
Yes, for sure. So in my particular story, I didn't have any miscarriage or any trouble with infertility. We were able to get pregnant really quickly, and then a healthy pregnancy for what I knew. So my son died of a cord accident. The cord was wrapped around 4 times. And so I vaginally delivered him, knowing that he was stillborn. So I was able to deliver him some 8 hours later. But there was so much confusion because I had never had the expectation or even the thought that this might happen. If anything, it maybe would have been the question of, do we have a home birth or a birth at a hospital where if there's something that goes wrong, we can do something about it. But no one had ever talked to me really about what it meant to birth death. I had no concept of that. And it was our first child, which was significantly different on my psyche. I mean, trauma is when something happens out of order. And I think if we'd had other kids to entertain us or to call us away from our grief, that would have been maybe a kindness. But for me, all I know is in my story, it was a first child. It was unexpected. And I had to go and make a lot of decisions, even decisions that he was turned, upside down. And why am I forgetting the name right now, Lindsay? He was breech. And so I even had that question of, do you want to deliver him vaginally if he's breech? Just things I had never, and in the midst of my grief and overwhelmed with all these questions I had never thought to think through. I had to make a lot of decisions and did birth him breech. And so even what that cost on my body in additional to just the grief of his death was something I had not really thought about. And I so wish someone had said, like, death is the most normal part of life. It's as normal as birth. But no one had really thrown that concept. I mean, I do remember for a friend saying, as soon as you start thinking about having kids, start preparing yourself to let go. And I am grateful for that, but I didn't even understand that that might mean letting go a child at birth. So yeah, does that answer your question of sharing?
Yeah, for sure. And I know we've talked about this offline, but I've had a similar experience where the tragedy of being separated from my son forever was overshadowed by the extent of my shock.
Yeah.
The extent of learning about what my body would have to go through. Being asked by the nurse, do you want to follow through on the birth plan? Which was, it felt like almost violent against me in the moment.
Yes.
Because the birth plan assumed a live birth.
Yes.
And I remember being so angry in that moment because the people who I thought I had pulled the right care team together, I felt very hurried through the experience. I felt like I was strange for needing to take more time. And we were in the situation where I'd been working so hard up until that point. I felt like I had done everything the right way. I had sort of a list of everything, a checklist of everything I needed to go off of. My husband was traveling for work and he was going to come in town as soon as I went into labor. And, I actually never went into labor. I had to start that process and choose to start that process. And that was very confusing because the process and the terminology is the same for a live birth versus birthing a deceased child. And they didn't even refer to it as a child. It was just fetal demise. And for a few hours, I had to just say out loud, like, is that death? Is that what that means? Because when you're sort of in that momentum of planning for 9 months, you're in that momentum. And one of the things I love about your experience with Brave is just how celebrated you were in pregnancy. I know that I felt almost robbed because I spent so much time planning for things that I will never experience with my son.
Yeah. Yes. And all of a sudden it's that mind shift that you don't have enough time to shift over to. And so you would have done probably your pregnancy so differently, even just if it was a concept, right? Even if you had that concept of how much time do you want with them? It's like, okay, I mean, I remember for us, they declared him dead, and then they said, when do you want to be induced? Right? I mean, just things we don't. Oh, okay. And then the pitocin, and like, are you going to start the drip? And then how long can I hold him after? Or all these questions that nobody, can you gather our friends? Can you call our family? It's just such a shift. And it does feel like there would have been some kindness to someone giving us this idea.
Yeah.
And if there's a medical team or people who can co-create the possibility of birthing life, or birthing death.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, because I feel like so much was missed. And we can talk about this a little bit later, but we have gone on to both create living babies, and in that experience, it is so starkly different from a physical care perspective.
Yes.
Um, just how our bodies responded. I mean, frankly, I was lucky that my blood pressure shot up because it forced me to stay in the hospital. But I also, months after our son Deacon's death, I found myself very upset that I didn't get the choice to go home, that I didn't get the choice to really process death. I mean, I got to do that in spending time with his body, but I also was dealing with the sort of stigma and shame because my mind was so wrapped up in how do I have like makeup and like a face on in a picture with my new child when I don't feel that way. I couldn't even wrap my head around that. And then to find out that I'm birthing a dead child and the option is to take pictures, it just felt incredibly morbid. And so I was processing like layers of things wish I had not been having to process
Mm-hmm.
because it
Yeah.
just felt like too much.
Right.
And I think now, us having me 5 years and you 9 years without this person, but yet having our DNA so interchanged, it's just no longer surprising to me how connected we are, how it is just part of the process of co-creating a family.
Right.
Is that commitment. I didn't realize that was even the commitment that I was making, doing this. And so I think by shielding us away from this situation, I took it from a very like literal standpoint. I was frustrated because I paid for a live birth.
Right. Right.
And I paid for information.
Right.
And I was very blunt with my provider, my doctor, who ended up retiring after 2 weeks after my son died, because it just showed her the importance of life and being with her kids. And I was like, I'm glad you get that choice.
Yeah.
I don't get that choice. And then I struggled with, what does sort of postmortem look like? And that was like postpartum and postmortem, which you're going through at the same time.
Yes.
And it's just like, we do that because we ignore this conversation. And we just, we can't do that anymore.
And I think we're afraid, right? Like you said, we're afraid almost if we talk about it, then it might happen. And that is one thing is I hate that this conversation or these conversations never came up till after. Like even just as much as we talk about the possibility of a child having a deformity or some kind, like what can there not be some invitation to? And these are considerations you'll have to make because like you said, financially, I know how much it costs to birth death. And
Yeah.
I had to pay that much money. And it's just paying that money after, or even my taxes and saying, I can't write off another child, even though I have all these expenses from a hospital of birthing a child or preparing for a child. And there's just all of these things that we don't talk about or don't know. and I just even think our physical bodies, right? I remember when I looked in the mirror and I saw the stretch marks, and I thought, I got stretch marks and I didn't get a baby.
Mhm.
And it was really kind of my husband to kind of reframe it for me and say, that is Brave's artwork on your body. Like, we don't have a refrigerator that will ever put his artwork on, but your stomach will bear his artwork. And that, but again, the reframing, we get time to try to see it a different way. The gift of him ever expanding my belly, rather than the cost it to bury him, and also what it costs to go into the funeral home. And by, I remember him asking me, this is 2 days after I had birthed him, he said, do you want a casket that is movable so that when you're buried, you would maybe move him to be buried next to you? I mean, again, thoughts you never have. So then I'm going to spend a couple $1,000 more to have a certain kind of casket, or that our first land that we ever owned before we bought a home was in a graveyard. We owned the land our son's buried in. And just these concepts that are so foreign and just taboo and not allowed to be talked about. And yet it's these decisions that keep me from having regret.
Yeah.
I love that we had a funeral with 250 people who came. I am so grateful that we stopped the crane from burying him in the ground, and we put dirt on his casket, and I buried my son. I got to play in the dirt with him. And so it's just these things our mind doesn't have time to reframe because we're in the trauma of it, rather than, oh, this isn't a foreign concept. How do I want to bury? How do I want to do death?
Yeah. 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 And because it was such a confusing time right afterwards, I had friends and family where it's like I couldn't communicate what I needed because I didn't know this was even an option. So I felt the pressure of having to explain what happened, even though I was 9 weeks after I gave birth to him, still waiting for an autopsy, still waiting for information. Still having conversations where people would say, oh, well, at least you can have a child, or you had a child, so you can have another child. And I'm like, right, but now I have ashes.
Right.
And what do I do with ashes?
Yes. Yes.
And so I just remember spending time like looking up like things to buy for a ritual or for a process. And then it's like, then I would get hit with the finances, or then I would get hit with, the way we handle, we don't have maternity leave in America. Right. So, that is, it's all compounded. And when that happens at a point where you're also in shock and your body is biologically responding to shock, you're not able to make the best financial decisions. You're not able to, if you're in a situation where, there you need legal help, if you're in a situation where, you have some sort of mental experience right afterwards because the level of shock.
Right.
I have people right afterwards who aren't able to process that any other child they have after that will not be that child sort of reincarnated.
Right.
And a lot of that, it's important to know, it's important to understand those layers for future pregnancies, for your own mental health. I'm sure you could talk about that. I'm sure we could talk about that like forever, but
right. And it's good what you say. I mean, what we do know from psychology and lifespan is that loss will only increase over the lifetime, right? And so it's really disconcerting when loss happens at birth, at this moment, this precipice where it's just so out of the timeline, it's so out of ordinary, and the trauma keeps us from engaging and being creative, because the invitation here is that we can continue to create, we can mark events, and that is as old as time. The idea of ritual and marking is part of that process. And so what do you do with ash? right? Do we mark our own bodies with that? I mean, one thing, my husband shaved his head, and then we had Brave's haircut, and we dreaded their hair into my hair, which was something we could do for free, something that was still felt like I could hold on to. My body wasn't ready to part with my son that it had carried. And so we are stripped of these options because we don't know how to keep creating when trauma hits us. And that's what I think is so good, to talk about this stuff and bring light to it. Can we plan so that we can continue to create, whether life or death is at the end of that creation process?
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah, I love hearing about the markings and rituals. One, because I'm still sort of unpacking that for me and what feels good with Deacon in particular, but I think it gives such a depth of permission, because the way we apply sort of uh, grief tactics, I would say, to healing is like so different with someone who's going through a child loss. And I sort of felt like I had to avoid this pressure of like getting back to work. You know, I had a boss who called me weeks after who said, well, at least you don't have a baby to nurse, so you can be able to get back to these clients.
Oh,
And
yeah.
luckily, you know, my brain had been rewired in the 32-hour labor and delivery with my son, so I could see how unhealthy that was.
Yeah.
Um, but at the same time, you know, the first time I heard his name spoken by someone else was 9 months after he died.
Mm-hmm.
And I think I had such a physical reaction to that, that it just showed me exactly where I needed to spend more intention and time with myself. It almost surprised, you know, I was like, it almost surprised me how much it brought up for me. And so I think that's likely what a lot of uh, you who are listening and viewing this might be feeling as we're talking about some of these things. If you weren't given the time or the space, or didn't have the privilege to have someone raise funds for you to be able to pay for a funeral, or have the privilege of, you know, telling my boss, like, go away, I'm taking my short-term disability, and I'm having someone talk to insurance, and I'm having someone pick up ashes. And my husband, you know, luckily he was raised on a farm, and so he had experienced life and death at birth from a animalistic perspective. And so his reframing, you know, he would say such powerful things over me during postpartum, like, your body is so strong and so powerful, and you're so beautiful, and things like that, that we actually don't unpack how strong and beautiful we are, no matter the outcome.
Right.
And
Right.
I think that's what is so sad when I spend so much time with people who've gone through either similar experiences or they're going through a loss. They don't know that about themselves. They take what's happening as like, I have failed.
Yes. 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 I love that he and you have adopted that word strong, because it's so true. The resilience of our body to create life is so amazing. And so I love that. And then what it looks like is, how do you mother yourself, right? Whenever you see your own reflection, we're given every opportunity to mother ourselves, and how we mother that child who is even dead, or that miscarriage. Even, I want to even say that, like, it's not just a stillbirth. There's a miscarriage. When a miscarriage happens and our body bleeds, what a beautiful strong body that is trying to create, that still is in that process. Like, it's really incredible. But I think we don't name that, and I think it's because maybe we don't know how to mother ourselves through
We
the
have terrible mother experience, you know, experiences with mothers. So we've avoided, I think for so long, at least I can speak from my experience, I avoided the idea. It's like I was told that this was part of my job is to be a mother, but then once I became pregnant, it's very early when you take that test now because of the way
Yes.
testing is evolved. We know so much more information sooner. And while that is valuable from an information standpoint, we internalize that like to such a degree that when you experience loss, at least for me, I did have miscarriage before I experienced life, my son's life. And so oftentimes I actually have to remind myself that he died,
Yeah.
especially right after he died. I had phantom kicks. My arms were heavy. I had a lot of physical sensations I was very surprised about. But it's because I wasn't acknowledging
Mm.
how with him my dreams for him died. My dreams for
Right.
what I was expecting motherhood to be like died. And I didn't know that then. I didn't understand that motherhood is sacred. Uh,
Yeah.
and even if it's an early pregnancy, even when you don't want to be pregnant, even when it's such an internalization that I just feel like women weren't set up to sort of in isolation be in that battlefield, because we're not called to do it alone. I know we've talked a little bit about the value of community and helping us like as we learn to mother ourselves, especially through loss. And I just think, if I didn't have community, which is something I started pulling together while I was pregnant, I started
Yeah.
realizing like, my husband's going to be gone. I should have a doula there. I don't know all of this information. I should have people there that have gone through this experience before. But it was all very last minute. And I actually spent a lot of time with colleagues and other friends who think that once they're pregnant, that's when they can make all the changes. That's when they can decide to do things differently. And that's just not reality.
Right. Right. And I think that's the hard part is that we have to actually teach
Mhm.
our tribe, our mothers, we have to teach people how to do this. And some of that grief is, why am I teaching when I'm the one grieving? And yet we do have to teach our community how to be with us. We often say, will I be a fool or will I be a coward? And I want to be found a fool attempting something, maybe being told that didn't work, rather than not trying at all and saying, you let me know what you need, because that means I've been a coward. I haven't risked to care for someone or enter into their grief with them the way I know I needed and the way I was met in my own grief from my own community.
Mhm. I often think that if these experiences with loss, miscarriage, and stillbirth, um, if they hadn't been set up as experiences to avoid, and telling womb carriers that they can avoid these things if you try really hard, if you follow all the rules. I wonder if it's just something that I remain curious about, is if we would appreciate what we're doing better, the work that we're doing, if we knew that it was always a surprise. I spend a lot of time working with women who are mourning a sense of loss, even if that child has not died. That child is a sex that they weren't thinking, or is
Yeah.
it different? It appears to be different than they were thinking, or has different marks on their body. You know, I just think it sets us all up incredibly poorly. And while it was maybe had the best intentions that we focus on positive outcomes, I think we've sort of pushed it too far and put all the ownership on women when it's such a divine privilege and invitation that gets lost
Right.
in appointments and scans. And I remember thinking, because I had experienced miscarriage before, Deacon, that I thought that I was sort of safe after I hit 12 weeks. I kept
Yeah.
thinking, oh, then we get to the anatomy scan and we're safe and I don't have to worry about that. And in my pregnancy with him, like I said, because I was so distracted with work and just having to do the feeling like I had to do the checklist, I was not allowing myself to be present in that pregnancy. And I think it is a regret I will live with, and one that I'm proud to live with, because that's how much his life made a difference to me.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I love that you say it that way.
Mm-hmm.
One regret that I am proud to live with. I mean, it just also speaks to the gift, which I think you champion. And I love that about your spirit, is like, you want awareness so that people can get the goodness out of the time they have with their child, even if it's only in utero.
Yeah.
And I think that's, at least that's what I hear from you, is always championing this, like, let's face this possibility so that we can have our awareness of how we want to do this life that we do get with them. And
Yeah.
I think that's true for me, is because of Brave's death, I don't go to any of my kids' birthdays without a reverence of excitement for celebration. Like, because of how I've known death, life gets celebrated to a deeper way. To the level I've grieved is the level I celebrate. And I think that's what you're saying. Like, his life meant so much.
You know, hell, you're saying that. I do that for everyone's birthday now. You know,
Yeah.
some people like really harp on aging, and I'm like, are you kidding me?
Yeah.
Can I tell you how incredible you are, that you are here, that you have a heart that is beating?
Yes.
You're breathing, that you get to do these things. I mean, when, you know, I think you might be able to relate to this. When I run into people now with my daughter, who's going to be 4 in the fall, everyone is like, oh, she's getting so big, stay small, why are you growing big? And I'm like, no,
Let her grow.
yeah. So it's totally changed my life in such a drastic way, because I was so shut down before, and I didn't realize that just because my son died, that's not it for me. I was also rebirthed in that experience, and I'm constantly continued to be refined and rebirthed through miscarriage at different times, through, you know, the changes that my daughter goes through. It's a total reflection of you know, myself and my own growth and development. But I think when we hide these stories of loss,
Yes.
it kills me, because at the same time, we're telling the people who've had those experiences that what you went through doesn't matter.
Right.
Yeah,
Right.
what you went through should be forgotten and moved past, because that will help your pain. And
Right.
that's, you know, couldn't be further from the truth.
Right. And part of, even for me, the miscarriages that I had after, so I didn't have miscarriages prior, but I had after, I did those lives so differently because of it. And I was so grateful. And I think, you know, that even culturally, other cultures, mostly third world cultures that are closer to the normalcy of death, they celebrate life. So when you make it to 40 years old, you're celebrating it. Where I feel like it's a common thing to be like, I'm 39 plus 1. There's always this, the Western culture of like, I want to stay young. Where in these other places, it's like richness that you have had a long life, or that you are aging. And so I
Also,
agree.
talk about it being classified as a geriatric pregnancy. So that might have a little bit to do with, I mean, I literally, when I went through my pregnancy with my daughter, I mean, I was at points re-traumatized. I had such a good therapist to sort of like, she was on text when Deacon died, and, you know, was with me anytime I needed her through pregnancy with my daughter. But I just remember having to like be very direct with my medical team, and like, we don't use geriatric pregnancy around me. We don't talk about it this way. They wanted to debate, you know, induction. There's just so much conversation around things that actually haven't happened yet. And so every time we would, they would want to spend my time debating how this would turn out, I said, would this have made a difference with my son's care? And they're like, no, you having a decision would not have made a difference. And I'm like, okay, then I can go, because this is actually taking time away from time with my daughter. And I actually felt and experienced like a connection with her that I had to experience for us to survive postpartum. Because when she was born, it was so fast.
Yeah.
It was so, I'm gonna like say this word and it like I was about to say it and then I thought it and I was like, that sounds ridiculous. It was so delightful. And just to be with her, but it felt too perfect. It felt too right. It felt like, why did we get to experience this with her and not with him? And so if I hadn't bonded with her in utero or been able to work through some of that, and at the same time had people in my life who, when I was feeling high levels of anxiety or highly depressed about my failure to produce a live child after so much trying, to hear people say like, you are not what happened to your son, that this is a totally different creation and it's going to be a totally different experience, and anticipating that it won't be anticipating and being scared is totally normal.
So normal.
But we don't really allow ourselves to process that. And in fact, we've talked about it, the stigma and shame around how quickly women should recover and be able to move forward, when frankly, I will never move forward. My son has not been with me for 5 years.
Right.
I will always have deep memories of the last times we've spent together. And it's such a different understanding if you haven't experienced it yourself.
Right. And it's good even how you ask, like, the question, what information do you want shared and not shared? And I think that's what got me into this was people didn't post. You post just about anything on social media, but people weren't posting the loss, miscarriage or stillbirth. Like, it was all hush hush. And then, the friend who did post a picture of her with her stillborn daughter, like, that, and it comes up, it's still in her photos on her social media. And it kind of catches my breath. And yet, like, we aren't asked these questions of how do we want to share whatever experience happens to us.
And I think being clear about what you want, what works for you, because everyone in your sphere who knows that you're pregnant, who you've made it through, past 20 weeks, which is stillbirth. That was another thing. I was very confused around like the terminology and when certain things happened and how it sort of all clumped together. But like, everyone's natural reaction is like, I want to protect, I want to respond. Let me rescue them out of this situation. And it's like, no, I need to process the fact that I will never see this person.
Okay. Yeah.
And all the dreams. And, so it's like, I tell people, because I'll get questions, well, would you have a baby shower? Would you do certain other type rituals that we have? And to me, it looked totally different with my daughter. I wanted to celebrate her, but I also needed to celebrate myself. So I did some sort of ridiculous things. I got tattooed for the first time when I was pregnant.
Yes.
Just all of these things, because I really wanted to sort of like take life by the horns and like, frankly, ride the shit out of it. And I was like, know what's going to happen. And I lost a lot of friends because they didn't think I was being like careful enough. They didn't, I would eat what I wanted, and I would, within reason, like I didn't know about some of those typical things like sushi or having a glass of, just things like that. I allowed myself to experience life alongside creation. And I didn't do that with my son. I had tried to avoid that it was even happening to me.
Yes.
So I remember continuing to say with my son, I just feel like all these things are like, it's just taken over my life and I can't control it. And I wish someone had said, like, why do you think that is? Why do you think you can't control it? Maybe because you shouldn't. Maybe there's a
Right.
purpose, because there's a key development that's happening, and just preparation for what life with a person and child's going to be, you know?
Yes. Yes.
So tell me a little bit about how your experience with Brave shifted either who you had involved or what you sort of planned. I know we've talked a little bit in general about having a death plan alongside a birth plan, but you know, that sounds very daunting. I think if you just
Right.
a death plan, like who wants to plan for that? But yeah, maybe could you unpack that a little bit?
Yeah, I think that the kindness that came from living the fullest out of the grief, living the fullness into the grief and marking the grief, gave me some idea of how to go forward. So I had 2 live healthy births after that, and then 2 miscarriages,
Okay.
and then I had a emergency C-section for my last child, who had the cord around his neck also, and I came 6 weeks early and was in the NICU. So there was a lot of unknown in birth for me. And I would say, like, I love that you even said, I got a tattoo, I ate things I wanted. Like, there's something where none of us know. We don't know when death is coming, but we know it's coming. And so how do we want to live? And I feel like that informed the rest of my pregnancies.
Yeah.
I was always trying to live to the fullest so that no matter what happened, I knew that I was present and I was living my life. So yeah, I don't know if that answers your question, but that's what
Yeah,
came.
I think you either included this in your latest book or we were talking about it, but did your last pregnancy, because it was a cord situation, did you know intuitively that something was wrong? And so you felt like you were sort of more connected with being an advocate for your health and your child's health?
Right. So, kick counting, which was not a big thing with my first child. My doctor didn't tell me to kick count. Would it have saved Brave's life? Potentially. Who knows? We don't know, but I was an avid kick counter, like counting kicks of the baby after that. And so I would go in for non-stress tests pretty often with my other kids, and my other pregnancies. And so, yes, this was and that messes with your psyche. Whereas my 4th child, I would not have known to save his life except for having lived through my first child's demise. And so I noticed that he was really still, and I was obviously more heightenedly aware of that because of my story. And I went in, and it was crazy. Even the doctor said he's fine. And then 2 minutes later, they came in and we're gonna have an emergency C-section. It was like, even the doctors don't know everything, right? So it's like, even if I had done my best, there were still conflicting responses. You're fine, go home. You should stay. We should go into surgery. And so, I mean, that, I think, messed with me of when we did the emergency C-section. The doctor said, and she had known my story and was part of the birth doctors that were with Brave also. She just said, this would have happened a lot differently had you not come in. It would have been similar to Brave's story. And so that is just a weight, again, this weight that we have to carry versus we also don't know. I mean, I had to work through, what does it mean that was it my fault that I didn't catch the slowing of my son's movement? And is it also because I caught the slowing of my last son's movement that we saved him? And that is a lot of work for a mother to do. The uterus is supposed to be the safest place, right? The womb, we always think of it as being so safe.
I was going to say that we talk about that all the time. I hear people say, well, even people who are pregnant will say, oh, well, they're in the safest place. I don't need to worry about it. And it's like, you don't need to worry about it. But I am so curious, if we were taught differently, if our first interaction was to be an observer and really focus on getting to know ourselves and what's happening in our body.
Yes.
It honestly just, it starts in puberty that we're just told to like avoid, fix, don't, and it just carries on through this process. I love that you said you wouldn't have known to be an advocate for your last child if you hadn't had the experience with Brave that you did. And, I think that's just it, right? This is almost an induction to being an advocate for someone else.
Yes.
You don't know what you don't know, but also it feels like we're also trying to like keep things hidden and away from people really understanding. Like, if you don't really know about birthing and bearing a child, then it won't happen. Then you won't have,
Right.
you can control the outcomes. And I just always, like I said, I wonder what that robs from us as humans. I wonder what that just ignoring, that practice of ignoring, what it does to us. Yeah. And I think thinking about a death plan, when would you say, I would say with my daughter's birth, I planned both, but I was not as intense about it with the birth plan with my son. It was more like, these are things this is the types of environments I would like to be able to achieve and happen, but it was a lot looser. I think this idea of plan, it's just like having elements in place for certain situations. And around birth, I think it's because I've found myself being so uncomfortable with the waiting process that I create more work around certain things.
Sure.
I mean, even the playlist, I was like so stressed about having a birth playlist. And then when we found out Deacon died, I was like, I don't even care. I mean, I think there was like ridiculous songs playing. And it all just sort of happened really organically because I, for the first time in my life, stopped trying to control it. When I found out that he died, it was just like, I give up. What?
Yeah. Yeah.
And I think that was actually like the best place to start.
So well said. The best place to start. I think that's so true. I don't think we will know everything, right? Like when you said like, when do we prepare the plan? Well, part of it is as soon as we decide we even want to try to have kids, we have to prepare for what if there's infertility? What if there's loss? And so I think that's a part of it is we always maybe start planning to the level we may need. And then we get to the point where if you have trouble breastfeeding, you get a lactation specialist, right? Because you need one. Well, if you have a stillbirth, then you get a professional to come in, like while you were, what's it called? The photography company that comes in and takes pictures of stillborn. Like, I think one part of it is we can only plan so much. So what is it to have an openness to, I will call the specialists in when I need certain things. But for death, we don't know who those specialists are. So even having maybe a list of, these are places I might need to call if things go this way, which is the same thing we do for birth. If things go this way, what would your plan be? Well, if things go to burial, who might be the specialist that we call in to come and help us in that process of planning? So yeah, I don't know that we can be so prepared at the beginning, but that we would know that there's options. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. And just acknowledging that there are options and that you should go beyond planning for a live birth. I get that question too from a lot of friends, like, well, what can I do to avoid the situation you had?
Yes.
Which is sort of like a heavy question, right?
Right.
For me, now I can say I would never avoid it. I met my son.
Right.
It's what made me fall in love with wanting to have children. The reason we continue to pursue procreating, and it's the reason, that I think I parent totally different with my daughter, because I have such a different level of respect for life.
Right.
And I didn't know that before. So when someone is like, well, what can I do to avoid it? I've now said, like, well, have you made a birth plan? Oh, you have. Great. You still have 5 months to go. Have you thought about a death plan?
Yeah.
And obviously that's a lot for them to unpack.
Sure.
But I think it helps. And I think that's frankly why community exists, right? So people who've gone before in these situations can say, like, I'm okay. Look at me. You can do it. We can get through it together, but also we can talk about it, and we can talk about what you would want in a situation where you have a finite time with your child. And I think we don't talk about finite versus, assuming that we're going to have an indefinite amount of time. And I think maybe it's even reframing it as like,
Excuse me.
bless you, if you had only one day with your child, what would you do? Because I think a death plan is scary. It's like, because when we think about traditional end of life, it tends to be, you've lived a long, full life, you die of natural causes. How would you like that to be? But that's not always the case. And it's a large amount of people, especially in the current crisis and what's happening, are going to experience it even more, right? So unfortunately, we wait until situations like this to have a plan. But and I know you are too, a huge advocate for education around this starting earlier. Like my daughter knows about miscarriage. My daughter knows about her brother. She's seen me marked miscarriage. She saw me sort of like clumsily, chaotically go through that as I was trying to process it. And I would have never done that ever had I not had the experience that I had with Deacon and stillbirth.
Right. Yeah, it's so true. It is so true. And I think that's why having professionals educated on it. So if it does feel too much for the mother to hold, right, that her partner or a nurse or a doctor has this information, even all the paperwork I'm given in a folder when I start a pregnancy, like it can be in that place and you can come to it as you need, but just for someone to at least say it, so it's not just so foreign. And that's what makes the difference between trauma is that we didn't have the concept of it happening, and then it happened when it shouldn't have. And so to kind of help our brains get an understanding feels really important.
Well, and I think taking that idea of advocacy, I mean, really, I wasn't a true advocate for myself, and I didn't understand what that was until I was sitting in the doctor's office thinking I was pregnant again, and they said, "Oh, congratulations. this is your first. And I was like, I literally just delivered with you guys months ago my dead son. So if we're going to work together, you have
Yes.
to acknowledge that I am not a first time mom.
Yes. Oh,
I will not, you can put in my chart that I'm deciding not to do something,
right.
but I need us to acknowledge that more monitoring would have
Yes.
saved my son's life. There's
Mhm.
you know, we didn't, everything that came back from the autopsy was inconclusive, which, as you may know, and I think, I'm not sure how many people are aware of this, but most most people who go through this experience don't get information back.
Right.
So the fact
Yes.
that you even know it was a cord
Right.
complication is it has to feel like some sort of, I don't
Kindness.
know, maybe like a kindness,
Yeah.
but
Weirdly enough. Yes.
there's part of, I think, stillbirth that it is that mystery. Like you will never know how your child died.
Right.
Um, and for some reason, I don't get really hung up on that
Hmm.
because I can look at my daughter who's 4 and I have no idea how she's still here, how she's still, you know, we just don't know. There's so much of a mystery that I'm glad I don't sort of like harp on that, but I know
Yeah.
people who haven't gone through this experience, that is something that comes up a lot. Like, I don't even know how you could go on living not knowing how your child died or not knowing how that happened. And
Right.
wonder if part of this reframing, allowing people to know that this is actually part of the creation process, a
Yeah.
tragic, potentially traumatizing one, but it doesn't actually have to be that way.
Right. Right.
Um, I just want, you know, I know you're trying to do this different with your children too, but just being able to give that information,
Yeah.
and to still be excited about the potential of, you know, participating in creating the next generation.
Hmm.
Like that should be exciting enough, you know.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, we have a lantern ceremony every year, and my kids know, and they light lanterns and they send them to their brother. And so there's a knowing already that I wasn't even privileged to, that I'm grateful they have.
Yeah, I love that.
Yeah.
We are at an hour somehow. I'm always love how I blink and our conversation seems to evaporate. But
Yeah.
is there anything that you feel like folks should know before we let people go? I know we have some resources here for people to reach out.
Yeah. And I would say we have more resources. Again, we told our story, I think, to start the conversation. And we welcome anyone who wants more information or particular information on ritual, on marking, on planning and the questions you might ask. So I think we want to first just start the conversation, right? And then invite the particularities to come, and we want to offer those as they're needed. So yeah.
For
So,
sure. Thank you, Christy, for just holding this space and sharing. I'm not sure how you've handled the journey of grief, but I sort of feel like this conversation feels like just like a warm hug in a weird way.
yeah,
So,
yeah.
so I really love that, and I'm looking forward to yeah, just continuing the conversation and staying in touch.
Yes, yes. I love that.
Okay, we'll
Thank
talk
you.
later.